So welcome everyone to this new PAGES ECN webinar. So the PAGES ECN organizes a lot of nice webinars, and to learn more about the other things that PAGES ECN is organizing, you can find us on Twitter, and our website is part of PAGES. So go check us out if you haven't done so already. For the webinar, we are now very happy to host Erin Martin-Jones, who will talk about communicating your science. And Erin has a background in geochronology. And during her PhD and postdoc, she linked geochronology with societal issues in East Africa. She also has a lot of teaching experience, according to her website. And in a new job, she is now communication officer at University of Cambridge, and also at at the museum.
Aberystwyth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she is here to share with us her experiences on outreach. So please go ahead.
Thank you. So I guess you can all hear me okay. And the next step is for me to share my screen. So can you all see that okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so thank you all for coming here today, joining me. It's a lovely sunny afternoon here in Cambridge. The sun has just come out. And I get to talk about one of my favourite subjects, which is science communication. So yeah, hopefully this talk will give you some useful tips. If you're a scientist looking to just sort of talk to amongst your peers and better talk during conferences and that sort of thing, or whether you're thinking of going on into actually following a career in science communication. So I hope this will be useful for everyone in the audience. So yeah, as Nick said in his nice introduction, I work jointly between two institutions at the University of Cambridge. So the Department of Earth Sciences and the Sedgwick Museum. So it's a really nice, varied role. So I just wanted to start off with a little bit about my journey into science communication. And as Nick said, I did start out as a scientist, studying volcanic ash in Cambridge's geography department. The ash is the funny brown stuff in the microscope image there. And I had a lot of fun. Actually, one person that's in the audience today is Alma, who is one of my lab buddies. You can see us having fun in the lab on the left there. And I always had a lot of fun working in the lab, doing science in general. But it did take me a little while to figure out what I wanted to do with that training. So it has been a pretty windy road, and I think it's kind of reassuring for early career researchers to hear that. And I think what really helped me along the way is that I dabbled in school workshops, so teaching over the course of being a researcher, as well as sort of doing things like school workshops that you can see on the right there. But it was only in the last year or so that I really got involved full-time in science communication, and particularly writing about science. So that's going to be the main focus of my talk today, although I do have a fair bit of outreach experience. So currently I work mainly in the Earth Sciences department. That job involves running the news page. I cover lots of varied news. I had a story this week on orcs and penguins, another story about one of our researchers running a marathon dressed as a dinosaur. I do also cover serious news like climate change stuff as well, but it's very varied. And there as well, I also run the blog as well as social media. So I really do enjoy it, and it's been a real learning curve, but I am still on that journey, so I might not have all of the answers today. But yeah, hopefully I'll give you some good tips to get started with science communication. So just to give you a little rundown of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to start with the basics of what science communication is and looking at the broad types of science communication. And then I'll take a step back and look at why science communication is important, why we should all be doing it, before spending the last half of the talk on basically how to communicate and mainly how to reach different audiences with things like analogies, using everyday objects, and also storytelling. And then we'll round up by putting it all into perspective. So let's start with what science communication is. And this is actually a quote from an organization here in the UK, which is STEM Learning. And they say that science communication is the practice of informing, educating and raising awareness of science-related topics and imparting a sense of wonder about the world. And I really like that last half of that quote. Some of you probably already know that this is kind of broadly what the topic is about, but there's also a lot more to the topic as well. So it is instrumental in developing science policy. So for instance, I always think that without the communication, science doesn't really have the same reach in society. So it's really important to get out there and inform policy. And there's also a lot of work that goes on to understand how the public learn and engage with science. And that's really important for building long-term relationships between the public and scientists and forming that trust that we need to achieve as well. So science communication is really quite broad. I thought I would start by asking the audience a question, and you can write the answer in the chat. But my question to you is, why are you here at this seminar? And why do you want to share your research? What's your main kind of goal? And I'll see if I can find the chat. Ooh, yeah, okay. So yeah, if you have an idea, just feel free to pop something in the chat box. Don't worry if you don't, because we will look at some stuff in a moment. So for me, personally communicating science, I've always just been tempted because it's fun, and you can kind of get up there and use some humor, creativity. Yeah, so Alma says science and communication, they come together. That's great. Ooh, lots of stuff coming. Yeah. So Am says it's important to reach a broader public than just other scientists for a better understanding about climate, etc. Nick says to engage people in my research. If they're engaged, I think that my research is somewhat relevant. Yeah, so it's all about seeing where it comes into society. Okay, I'm just trying to figure out how to get rid of that. I'm just going to minimize that because then I can close this. Okay. Sorry about that. So here's some ideas then on why it's important to share your science. Some really nice ideas there. But like I said, for me personally, it's just fun. You get up there, you can go out there and use opportunities to use humor, creativity, work with new people. And I think one of the important things for me is that it's really gratifying to be a role model for careers in science and see people inspired. I think one thing that is kind of obvious when you think about it, but people don't often realize, is that by taking the time to sort of digest and distill down your research into clear messages, you not only get a new perspective on your work, but you can also justify your work more effectively. And that can be really important for academic talks. So even just talking to your peers or grant proposals as well. So science communication is in general a really good skill to develop. And of course, so many jobs are underpinned by good communication. So those are just a few reasons. And we had some really nice ones in the chat there as well. So I wanted to reflect briefly on who we normally see in the limelight talking to the public. We know from that previous slide that science communication is worthwhile for scientists, but we don't often see them talking to the media. So why is that? Well, it's often the people with training in communication, like politicians and government spokespersons, that we see. So that is the main reason. There may be several, but for us as scientists, it can be pretty daunting. But I want to kind of reassure you that with some practice and some preparation, good science communication, it is easy and it's also worthwhile. So this is a really helpful graphic from an Ipsos Mori survey, which is a UK government think tank. And this is basically a graph showing the public's perception of different professions. And it is a UK-based survey, but it is global in its reach in terms of the people that were asked. And you can see what's really nice is that scientists, the medical profession, and teachers are all up there at the top. So this is something to celebrate, right? That the public, they do hold us in high regard. They do want to hear our expert opinion, but we do need to deliver it in the right way without sort of overwhelming them with the facts. I think now it's a really important time to share your science as well. So science communication is no longer a fringe activity. You'll have seen with the rise of social media and the importance of outreach in calculating research impact, both of those factors mean that more people are dabbling in science communication. I think as a community, so thinking of the PAGES community in particular, it's especially timely because we're seeing research on climate, the environment continually in our news, as it should be. So we have, as a community, an important perspective, right, on how the Earth works. So let's contribute that to public knowledge. I don't want to go into the second aspect too much, but as you're probably aware, the geosciences from that perspective do have a bit of a bad press reputation amongst the public, often linked to mining and oil. So let's tell the whole story about our subject and give the public again the sort of breadth of knowledge about our research. And the last point, again, is also a massive topic, the topic of misinformation. We're seeing an influx of that. And one of the best ways of tackling that is to develop trust in scientists by getting out there and talking and showing our friendly face as well. So there are many forms of science communication, many forms. I've just put them into three sort of broad silos here, just to explain them clearly. But the first is hands-on engagement, okay? And this is what we typically associate with science communication. It's something that probably a fair number of you might have dabbled in. It includes things like science festivals, museum events, and school visits. And it really is the best way to reach the public because it's personal and it builds relationships as well. So I thought I would show you some images here from my colleagues at the Sedgwick Museum and some of their outreach activities. And you can see on the top right, someone sifting through some gravel. And this is actually an activity called Gravel Hunters, where kids can search, they're instructed on how to sort of search through gravel driveways for fossils, other cool rocks. And that's been immensely popular throughout the pandemic. Because it's also really accessible. So people living in urban areas can just kind of go to their local park or even their own gravel driveway and have a look through. So a lot of it with science communication is also thinking about how to make things accessible to multiple audiences. The other two images, sorry, they're a little bit grainy. This is from a project, an exhibition called Community Cabinet. So this is where members of the public bring in their favorite rocks and fossils to be displayed along with their stories behind them. And so there's really nice work going on surrounding that. It's being run by Rob Theodore, who's up in the top left there. And all of these activities have been continuing in kind of safe formats throughout COVID. So they've been really nice for community activities. So you can imagine that it's really hard to replace stuff like that. So the second format of science communication is traditional journalism, which is really kind of the opposite of what we've just seen. Very different. Here you can reach the masses through print, so newspapers, magazines, and also broadcast media, television and radio. So the content is usually trustworthy compared to a lot of the stuff we get online, but you often lose the personal angle that we've just seen. I was just showing you four clips of a news story here, science news story on Earth's early magma ocean, and that wound up in a few places online earlier this year. And this is actually a story that I wrote myself, which I was really pleased with. It started out as a press release that I wrote. And for those of you that don't know, these are short communications. They get sent out to journalists and they highlight new science. So they're written for a public audience, but always get approved by the scientist involved. So there's a process where I interview the scientist, draft it up, and they always see it. So they do offer, so people like me do also offer a lot of support. If, for instance, you're approached by a journalist, we can help you kind of field questions and sort of do general preparation for that. So my advice is to make good use of your institution's press office. Don't forget about them, and let them know when you've got a paper accepted. They'll be there to kind of support you through the process. So this is the last format that I'm going to talk you through. And this as well, probably many of you will have been dabbling in this to a certain extent. This, like the mass media, gets you a large audience, but it's a bit different because you do have the controls over it, which is good. So you have lots of space to put a personal touch on your own work, which I really like. And I've just put some examples of science communicators that I'm a fan of that are doing really cool work online. So for instance, from podcasts like the What on Earth podcast to a couple of nice social media profiles there in the middle. One of my favorites down the bottom is a YouTube channel from Gemma Neumann, who works at the Royal Institution, and you can see her Microscope Monday video there. She does lots of fun experiments. So my advice is, if you're interested, remotely interested in getting into science communication, have a dabble and try it out using one of these mediums, social media, blogging, and see if it's for you. So we looked at those three broad brush types of science communication, and they seem very, very different. But whichever approach you want to use, the core communication strategies are essentially the same. So let's now, in the last half of this talk, take a look at how you can start putting these strategies into effect. So I've got another fun task for you, which is just to sort of take a moment and imagine you are talking to a child or perhaps a grandparent. And in that kind of headspace, can you explain your research to a layperson in just a couple of sentences? So it could be your PhD, it could be your postdoc, or maybe a recent paper that you've had out. So that's pretty difficult to do that on the spot. It still frightens me. And then can you make what you're telling that person so exciting that they want to keep on listening? And that is really quite difficult. So with all that in mind, you might be feeling quite kind of mind blown by this point. You might be a little bit confused, like my cat here, who often looks a little bit confounded. But don't worry, that's quite a lot to take in. We'll be looking at how to sort of break that down in a little bit. But one thing to bear in mind is that first question, can you explain your research in just a couple of sentences, is a really common question for journalists to ask. So if you talk to the media, always have that one prepared. And the next question, the one that I always ask to scientists when I interview them, is why would I care? Why would someone on the street or in the public care about this bit of research? So have those two ideas already prepped before you speak to them. Oops. So yeah, with that in mind, it's obviously a real challenge to distill down your research into very clear message, but also make it engaging. So I'm going to talk you through the sort of basics of how to do this as we go on. And there's three main factors. The first is to identify your audience, but also identify with your audience. The second is to hone your strategy for different audiences, just like you'd adapt your CV for different job applications. So use different strategies. And then a second element of reaching these different audiences is to tell a story, tell the personal stories behind your research, and also to use analogies to explain these complex topics clearly. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at now, going through each of those steps. So this first step then. Okay, being a bit slow to click. So I'd like you to have a think about a science communicator. Could be someone that you've come across recently, or someone from your childhood, someone that inspired you. If I can figure out how to get the chat box up again, I'd love to see your responses. So feel free if you have any ideas. For me, I'd say one of my A-level teachers. So when I say that, between 16 to 18 years old. So my geology teacher was really inspirational and also incredibly charismatic and quirky. When we're thinking of strategies, it's often those people that we remember as well. So for some reason my mouse isn't quite shut. Okay, fine, I have the chat. Okay, I don't think there's been any responses in there, but that's totally fine. Feel free as we sort of proceed through if you want to drop something in. So let's move on a little bit and have a look at a science communicator who had communication down to a T quite a few years back now, but we're thinking of Aristotle. And according to Aristotle, every good speech should have three pillars. And those were, according to him, ethos, pathos, and logos. So you might be familiar with these terms already, but I'll just run through in case you're not. So ethos is the ability to speak with authority and credibility, which is generally pretty easy for us as scientists. So we have the qualifications to support our thesis. And remember from that earlier bar chart that the public do trust scientists. They do want to hear our expert opinion. Pathos, I've highlighted in bold because it is really important and it's much harder for scientists to emulate this. Pathos is the ability to create emotion in the listener, and it's also a two-way thing. So they have empathy for you. And this means that you really need to be relatable and create an atmosphere where people basically want to be there. They're enjoying themselves because you're also a good entertainer. And the last aspect is logos. So this, again, we as scientists tend to have pretty well sussed. You have the data to support your arguments, and if someone comes at you with any conflicting ideas, you've got something up your sleeve, some data to reconcile that. So as I said, pathos is really the hardest bit for scientists to achieve, but it's possible, definitely, and we'll have a look at how to do this. So as I said, achieving pathos really means that you have to be relatable. So let your human side show. It's really as simple as that. And breaking that down then into what actually being relatable means, you need to use appropriate language, obviously. So no jargon, and no lecturing either. Lectures tend to work for academics, us as academics, but not so much for the public. So treat it like a conversation, maybe one that you'd have with your friend down the coffee house, for instance. I haven't put this in, but I think it's really important for us as scientists to show our passion. I don't think we have much trouble in showing that, but do let that come across. I think it's quite challenging when we get a lot of questions as scientists. That can be quite overwhelming because we're kind of taught to be defensive to a certain extent with our work. But do encourage curiosity amongst the public. So some of the best questions I've had have come from, for instance, kids who come up with all sorts of kind of left field ideas, but it does give you a new perspective on your work. So do encourage that. The last aspect is to tell anecdotes. So this comes under the storytelling side as well. So do tell your kind of fieldwork experiences, your lab work experiences, and the trials and tribulations of your work as well. It's actually, the public kind of think scientists are kind of mysterious. They don't know what we really do behind closed doors. So that in itself is quite fascinating for them. So this is just a note then, that we have a phrase for the public in general, which is the general public, but there are, of course, many communities with differing attitudes to science. And this graphic is from a Public Attitudes to Science 2019 UK government report. But the results of the sort of polling is fairly similar across the globe. So this is basically the public was sort of asked on their perception of science and other topics. So if we focus on the pie chart on the left there, you can see in blue, roughly 20% of people love science. They're really our crowd. They feel like us. You know, they go and visit museums, actively seek out information. The majority, so in purple, 55% or so, they're interested in science, which is good news, but they don't actively seek it out. So they are still very much within our reach. And the final 20% say that they are not interested in science, but remember that we may be able to reach them. It's perhaps just through a slightly different medium, for instance, going in with a TV program that they might be interested in, and other everyday objects, for instance, and then we can sneak the science in the back door. So we need to consider that when communicating, we need to potentially be considering those who are science enthusiasts, but also those who are less so as well. So the next few slides will help with reaching those different audiences. So it's next on to honing your strategy for different audiences, adapting your methods. And just like my froggy friend here, for instance, if you're looking at something in the distance, you put on a pair of binoculars, you adjust your focus. And one of the key ways of adapting your strategy is firstly start by doing some research on your audience. What are their interests? For instance, that TV program that might interest them. Find a hook that will work for them and frame your work within those. So you can also consider it like the contrast between talking to someone in the blue 20% of that pie chart who's regularly exposed to science in comparison to perhaps maybe talking to a child. You obviously wouldn't use the same language. So that's it at the very sort of basic level. So I've included an example here. This is a written example, but it would go the same if, for instance, you were doing a kind of proper outreach event as well. So this is a news release from NASA, and it's actually from last year, I think, discussing the ESA-NASA solar orbiter. And at this time, it was sending back the first close-up images of the sun, which is really cool. The article highlights the scientific importance of the work, including for understanding space weather. So it's very much pitched probably to science journalists, or at least someone with a sort of good knowledge of science in general. So I wanted to look at how this could be adapted to a very different audience. And this is in fact how that same article got adapted for a kids magazine. This is for the Science Plus Nature magazine, even released in the same year. And you can see they've given it a cool title, so Close Encounters. They've already put some nice images there as well. And that's one thing to note, that we usually as a community have a lot of nice images of landscapes. Could be like lab instruments that are quite impressive. So do use those when you're presenting, because it makes things a lot more snazzy to look at, draws people in. So this was actually, I've put on the right hand side there a couple of paragraphs from the magazine article. So you can see that it is quite a bit more conversational in tone. It sparks the reader's interest and curiosity. And I'll just read the first couple of lines to help you see that. It says, unless you're slapping on the sunscreen or snapping a selfie at sunset, you probably don't spend too much time thinking about the sun. Stop for a second and think about it now. So instantly that makes the topic a lot more relatable. It gets the reader, probably the young person, thinking kind of about their place in the universe, and making the sun seem a lot more important in terms of sort of your daily life and how it's central to everything. So you can see that's one way of adapting a science story for a different audience. And obviously that's written, but as I said before, it could work the same way for other outreach things as well. So as we go on into the next section, a lot of these similar strategies, so telling a science story, using analogies, also work for reaching different audiences. So it all kind of links up as well. So I thought I would start off this section just by showing you some of the typical science stories that do receive press and interest. And broadly, these can be sort of defined into five areas of interest for the public. So it's kind of a recipe or a checklist of things that the public like to hear about. So at the top is things that tend to be of human interest, and we'll pick up on this again in the storytelling element. But instantly you're achieving that pathos because you're introducing a relatable element. So this is a story called Young Activists Are Tired of Their Views on the Climate Crisis Being Ignored. The second aspect is if something's just completely brand new. So this was something that came out a few weeks back, a new bacteria that had been found in the Arctic that could break down crude oil and diesel, which is really cool scientifically. If things are timely, that always works really well. So for instance, if something's trending on Twitter, as an example, then if you make yourself a tweet, attach a trending hashtag, then that's an instant way to sort of get more attention for that tweet, usually. So again, this was kind of hooked to the recent wildfires, that timely news story as well, how to protect yourself from air pollution. Quirky stories, they're always a winner. So as you can see, my little friend on the right there, a chameleon. This story was also about chameleons. So scientists design a robotic chameleon that draws and changes, that crawls even and changes color. Draws would be really impressive. And finally, controversial, so things that completely sort of reset our understanding of science as we know it, the status quo. So this was another story, what if the Big Bang was actually a big bounce? So you can see the kind of stories that do get attention there. So once you do have an interesting piece of work that you want to talk about, there's a specific way of doing this that helps you get across a lot of information in a very clear and effective way. And this is using a format called the inverse news pyramid. And for us as scientists, we kind of need to do a handstand in terms of how we usually communicate. This is really the opposite. So we as scientists generally start with our introduction. We go on to the methods, results, and findings and conclusion. So instead, if you are writing a news story or even organizing an outreach event, you really need to have your findings at the very start. My analogy here is that it's kind of like telling the punchline of a joke first. And it seems a little bit like that's kind of spoiling it, taking all the fun away. But if you remember that the public and us in general, at the end of the day, we have a scroll through the news pages, for instance, and we very rarely will read the whole news story. We'll just read the first couple of paragraphs. And that's what we are continually like, us humans. So very time pressured. And that's why we really put the meat of the story first. So what's important, the most important stuff is first, generally in that format of what, why, who, how, and when. Other important details. So you can, I think it is important to talk about your methods because it kind of debunks what us as scientists get up to, but do talk about them in an approachable way. But that would always come second. And then finally, you kind of move on to the other background details. So here's an example of a nice news story. This was baby bats babble like babies, and this grabbed my attention. This was a BBC News story that came out a couple of weeks back. And once you've kind of seen this, you'll notice that all news stories generally, apart from long form ones, do have this inverse news pyramid structure. So it starts with the top line: scientists who systematically eavesdropped on bat roosts in Costa Rica have discovered baby bat babbling, lots of alliteration, bears a striking resemblance to that of human infants. So that's instantly starting with the what. You can imagine that as a research finding would have been hidden right down at the end of the article, but it's been brought to the top, brought to the fore. There's a second line that's sort of explaining the what in a little bit more detail. So the rhythmic sounds repeat, building block syllables, and then it moves on to why, linking to humans, because we're interested in ourselves apart from bats. And it says, this suggests just like human infants, their babbling lays the foundations for communication. And then it leads finally onto a little bit about who did this study, with a quote from Dr. Fernandez. So I challenge you now, when you're looking at these stories, you will see this structure everywhere. And it's not just for science as well. It goes for a lot of journalism, but it's also useful to talk about your research to the public in this way as well. So I just wanted to show you these thought-provoking images from a study that was done by Fermilab in 2010, just to highlight the importance of adding a human side to your story to make that content relatable. So give the people that are reading in the audience a human to kind of root for in the story, to bring out that empathy. So yeah, this Fermilab study, coming back to this, was done in 2010. So it involved taking 7th graders into a lab and having them draw scientists before and after their visit. So you can see that from their descriptions, from their drawings, they're getting a much more balanced view of the diverse roles in science. So I think to change the stereotypes that we do have, it's really important to change public perceptions by putting scientists in the spotlight. So I wanted to explain the human angle using something from my own work, which I think really captures the interest, the human interest angle. So I wrote this news piece on one of our researchers who was selected earlier on this year to join the core research team for the NASA Mars Perseverance team. And So when I interviewed him, it was just a few hours after he'd been selected for the team. He was really over the moon. And him and his 5-year-old son, they had been getting really excited together. And that childlike excitement really came across in our discussion. It's quite infectious. And I think particularly with space stuff, we can all relate to that sort of childlike angle, because, you know, we're all looking up at the sky at night and kind of thinking about, wow, how far away are those stars? And, you know, it's just fascinating. So that took my interest, and that made it into the press release that we did, but that was also picked up by some newspapers, that personal story. This is one from the Cambridge Independent. One of the outlets actually went to the local park and took a picture of Nick Tosca, the researcher, with his son in the NASA gear, and his little homemade Mars Perseverance rover. He made it from cardboard. So that's just one way of making a story very relatable, by including people, by including kids, so we can all kind of get that. So one of the easiest ways to break down a complex subject is to use an everyday object or an analogy that people are familiar with. And I'll give you some nice examples of those. But I think one note about numbers, which still scare me, my advice is to use them when you're talking to the public only when they are used really effectively, and when they make an important case. So when you're talking about numbers, though, there's certain ways of making them more digestible. So for instance, talking about 49%, round things up, or talk about roughly half. It's just a bit more approachable. I think in the geos as a subject, there's a lot of opportunity to talk about very large scale processes, tiny things down the microscope. So if we can break down these kind of even incomprehensibly long timescales as well, if we can sort of break those down into things that are comparable, like so many tennis courts or the thickness of a hair, instantly someone will go, oh, I know, okay, I get that, that really is tiny. And one last note about scientific uncertainty, which is quite a complex topic, but scientific uncertainty is really difficult to get across to the public. So I would generally stay clear and talk about your work within the realms of what is more certain. But if you must include, and I think, for instance, if you're talking about projections of climate change, then it can be really useful. Then consider making it maybe a bit more relatable by talking about events in terms of likelihood, so 1 in 10, and that sort of scheme is definitely used by the IPCC, their likelihood scale. So one of the easiest ways to break down a subject is to use an everyday object, an analogy that people are familiar with. And this is an example of a blog post that I wrote using a pebble as an analogy for a time capsule. I also used an array of coloured pebbles on a beach in the UK to explain the geology of the whole country. So I think this worked quite well because pebbles are something that most of the public pick up on a stroll along the beach, collecting one as a memento of their trip or something. So it is an easy gateway to discussion, but that probably won't engage all audiences. It might just engage the sort of top 20% of people that are super interested in science, and maybe some that are also interested in heritage as well. So using everyday objects, as I mentioned before, works really well, going beyond the sort of sciencey stuff, just the pebbles. And these are some examples of outreach that I have seen on social media. In general, I follow quite a lot of conversations on Twitter. For instance, hashtag geography teacher is really good for throwing up some good outreach ideas with, for instance, on the right there, a lovely edible soil profile. And these, as you can imagine, all work really well for sort of in-person, hands-on events. For some other really great ideas, you can also have a look at that Instagram profile that I've put on the top right there, Geologize Official, and that's run by someone called Hayden Mort, who have some really excellent videos of outreach ideas. He's got a really nice one which includes using fruit pastels, which are sort of one of the most popular candies here in the UK. They are jelly sweets covered in sugar, and in his experiments outdoors, he throws various heavy objects at them, at these candied sweets, I think bricks, and has a look at them afterwards, and all of the sugar coating is powderized. It's basically turned into icing sugar. So this is what he's using with using that experiment to explain is sort of an impact crater and the impact layer which forms across the globe resulting from this, the shocked quartz layer. So really nice way of explaining that. There's lots of other hands-on experiments that he has as well. So lots more great examples there. I can also use, for instance, analogies in my writing as well, smaller scale examples, for instance, using a lava lamp to explain convection currents. So you can also plug them into written stories as well, just to explain complex topics. And if you do find it's difficult to get a topic down, a complex concept down into an analogy, just keep breaking it down into steps until you do see some similarities with everyday objects or processes, and keep whittling that down until you see something. But it does take a bit of practice. So just rounding everything up then, and in summary, we've looked at why science communication is important and how we can go about it with three main strategies. By empathizing with your audience, that's really important. Developing different strategies for different audiences as well, and finally using stories and analogies to help reach those different audiences more. So just to bring it all together and now put it into practice, I wanted to end with a slide specific to paleoscience as well. And you can see here various news stories from print media that have highlighted paleoscience news stories over the last year or so. And it's really nice to see these stories cropping up. I think it's time that we spoke more to the public about paleoscience, because as we know, it is really important that, as we say, the past is key to the future. So all of this science really goes into climate models and things like that, but it is tricky to explain that topic to the public. So I would urge you to get out there, have a go at communicating your science, practice with your friends, family, get going with blog posts, for instance, and let's spread the good word about paleoscience. I'll just round up my talk with some helpful links and training, and I'll also drop those into the chat box, but I'm happy to take any questions afterwards, and thank you for listening.